Hello guys, so welcome back. This is an important episode. I will try to cover everything you have to know about alcohol and especially ethanol, which is the only type of alcohol that we can consume in larger quantity without getting sick. In this episode, I will cover the history of ethanol, how we developed that ability to consume alcohol without getting sick, and then I will go in through the modern day with the production of alcohol, especially on beer or distiller beer, so the base that we're gonna have for our whiskey, vodka or gin. I will also go on the specific on every single of the 4 main grains that you will use for whiskey and talk about how those grains contribute in flavor and what part they will play in the fermentation process. So let's talk about the history of fermentation, and first thing first, we should analyze the word fermentation. So fermentation coming from the Latin fervere, which is meant to boil. And if you ever did your homemade ginger beer, or ever visit a distillery or a brewery, you will see that in the production line, especially in the fermentation process, the mash or the wort is actually boiling just because releasing CO2 naturally by the effect of the conversion of alcohol. So how we actually start to drink alcohol? Well, we didn't start to drink alcohol, we start to eat alcohol, and that was back on 10 million years ago, when we didn't even split from the family of chimpanzee. We were kind of make ourselves used to eat the fruit that would potentially just eat the fruit that we couldn't reach, and they were there. And obviously by natural fermentation, so the yeast present on most of the time the skin of the fruit, it will start to convert the sugar and create ethanol. So it was fermented fruits really the very first food that we start to eat and help us to develop the ability to be tolerant to ethanol. Now, the first evidence of the very first intentionally fermented liquid was actually date back on 9,000 years ago, and that was in the Yellow River Valley in China, when we find a pottery that contained a sort of wine that was made from rice, honey and grapes. Unlike the sake, there wasn't any malt that sacrificed the rice as for the amaro fermentation, so it wasn't involved any koji, and so probably back then the only way to convert this starch into sugar, it would be by chewing it, so using the amylase in your saliva. Probably the most similar things to beer, it was fermented grain liquid, which was date back on 7,000 years ago with the Sumerian. They understood then just to soak hard bread in water, the water will have a secondary reaction which actually will make it safer to drink, and that was due to the fact then bacteria cannot survive in a liquid that will contain alcohol. One of the early writing about beer was actually again coming from Sumerian, and it was a prayer for the goddess Ninkasi, and it was a prayer on one side, on another a recipe to make a beer. And this was a easy way to remember the production line, or the method to produce beer in a time when just fewer people knew how to read. And only about 3,200 years later, on 1800 BC, we have the first writing about beer, and you can find it on the Epic of Gilgamesh, when it referred to beer as drinking beer is the custom of the land. 5,000 years ago in Uruk, the modern Iraq, we had the first form of payment with beer. Another example was during the construction of the Great Pyramid of Giza in Egypt, when every worker was actually paid between 3 to 5 liters of beer a day, and that was for nutrition purpose, but especially as a refreshment considering the hot climate over there. It was crucial in the construction of the pyramids. Around the same time, Germanic and Celtic population spread across Europe beer. Back in the day, beer was made from macerated fruits, a lot of different plants and herbs and honey, and especially narcotics herb, and everything but hops. Hops were only added later on in Europe, about the 822. The Industrial Revolution played a crucial part on the beer production. Before that, beer was produced and sold in a domestic scale. Also was produced and sold from a European monastery, but then after the Industrial Revolution, with the introduction of saccharometer, hydrometer, thermometer, people will actually have a better understanding, a better knowledge of the fermentation process itself, and obviously we move from a really small scale to an industrial production scale. The oldest food quality law or regulation on beer, which is still actually in act today, was dating back on the 1615 with William IV, or Duke of Bavaria, and it was the purity law, which is even have a really hard name, impossible to pronounce. I will try. Reinheitsgebot.
Reinheitsgebot.
It's only recently that we start to analyze a different category, different family of hops, or then we understand the hops was actually prevent beer to spoil, exactly like brown bottle, which was first adopted by an American brewing company in the 1912, and we nowadays are boom with this really small craft brewery, different profile of beer, which I would be happy to cover all, and mention it and talk about it when we actually will talk on beer as a subject. This one was just an introduction on the history of fermentation, and we now will talk about the chemistry as well. Right, so I will try to put all the ethanol fermentation in less than 2 minutes. To start with, the principle is quite simple. We got yeast, then convert sugar in carbon dioxide or CO2, and create alcohol. To go a bit on the specific, we actually need glucose. Glucose is present pretty much in all the sugar in nature, but to obtain that we will need to make sure that we will split molecule into simpler molecule. So in the case of the grain, let's take for instance the malted barley. Malted barley have maltose, and maltose is the saccharose formed by 2 molecules of glucose. To split those molecules, you will need an enzyme called amylase, which is present in the malted grain or even in your saliva. Now, once you convert this complex sugar into simple sugar and you have your glucose, glucose will then turn into molecule to pyruvate. Those 2 molecules will release carbon dioxide and will turn into acetaldehyde. 2 molecules of acetaldehyde will then be converted into a molecule of ethanol. So let's talk about beer production. We're gonna start with the grain, which we're gonna crush it and mix it with water. We'll then obtain the mash, which we will filter and boil it with addition of the hop. From that, we will actually cool it down, add the yeast, wait for the fermentation to finish, and then filter it or infuse it in some particular type of beer and bottle it. We can follow 2 main processes in the production of whiskey. The first one we're gonna mention is for the production of single malt or pot-still whiskey. This is probably one of the oldest methods to produce whiskey in the world, and is through the wort. The wort, it will be when we filter the mash and we turn it to this sugary liquid, which then will be boiled, cool it down, adding the yeast, and fermented before the distillation process. In the production of bourbon or Tennessee, most of the time we will use more than one type of grain. So, starting with the grain, we will crush it, turn it to a paste, but this time we will not filter it. What we obtain is called the mash or sweet mash. The mash will then be boiled with addition of different grain in determinate temperature. And from there, we will cool it down before adding the yeast. Well, the yeast will eat the majority of the sugar in the mash to indicate that the fermentation is finished. We will then be ready to distill it through column of pot still and create our American whiskey. Now let's talk a bit about the grain. The grain are extremely important, especially on the whiskey production, because depending on what type of grain you use and what's the majority of the main grain that you choose, you will actually change the category of whiskey. So from single malt to bourbon to Tennessee to wheat whiskey, rye whiskey, you can actually decide the future of your production based on what grain you choose. And it's extremely important to understand what is the function and the flavor and the role that each of those grain playing on the fermentation. Pretty much if you don't have a good distilled beer to start with, and you don't start with a great base material, so a great source of grain, you will never obtain a good spirit, so a good whiskey. Now, the most important, of course, is malted barley. Historically, that's the first one that we start to rely on for the creation of beer. Now, barley can actually be malted or unmalted barley. The malting process of the barley is extremely important, because once we actually obtain malted barley, we obtain that enzyme that we will need to convert our complex sugar into simple sugar, so the starch from the grain to something that we can actually convert from, with the yeast into alcohol. Now, how the malting process works? We pretty much treat the grain. We make the grain understand that it's about to become a plant. We feed it with water, and when the grain absorbs about 45% of the water, will start naturally to convert the starch to simple sugar and start the germination. To make sure then the germination is equal for all the grain, we will need to constantly turn this grain, and that's how we obtain malted barley. Corn is the star in bourbon production or Tennessee whiskey production, but there is a small category which I personally love to talk about, which is corn whiskey. Now, first of all, we need to talk about corn as a grain, which has been discovered only after from the early colony in America. Corn was a native crops from Mexico to Kentucky, of course, and it's been only after discovered. The very first colony that went there were actually Dutch colony, and once they actually saw that, they gave it the Dutch name corn. And that's why in America it still had the double name, from the Native American maize to the first Dutch colony corn. We know then in bourbon whiskey, for instance, by law 51% of corn is the minimum that you can use, but there is a maximum, and the maximum is 80%. If you use 80% of corn, you will actually take another category of whiskey called corn whiskey. And corn whiskey is the only whiskey in America that once it's come out from the distillation process, you don't call it moonshine or a new make or white dog or neutral grain spirits. You just call it whiskey. And the reason why is because you don't have to age it. If you want to age your corn whiskey, of course you can, but it needs to be in used oak barrel or uncharged oak barrel, which is completely different from a bourbon or a Tennessee whiskey production. So let's talk about wheat. Wheat is my favorite grain. I'm Italian, I grew up with pasta, pizza, bread, and I just love the flavor. But it's not actually that popular in whiskey production. So wheat whiskey needs to have at least 51% of wheat. Sometimes it can have 100% wheat, but there are not actually many brands up there. Also, wheat in bourbon production is kind of rare. It defines a sort of premium category, then it's not as often used as a traditional Kentucky mash bill or a rye mash bill bourbon. So who actually introduced wheat in the bourbon category? It was back in the 1849 when William Weller decided to take off the rye from the mash bill, which will give it a bit of harsh flavor and make it not as easy to drink as, for instance, single malt or Irish Scotch whiskey, which were actually #1 sold whiskey in America back then. And he decided to remove the rye and substitute it with wheat, which will contribute with honey flavor, dry fruits, and emphasize all the sweetness from the barrel and from the corn. It definitely changed the game, because from that moment, bourbon was #1 sold whiskey in America. So let's talk about rye. Rye can create what is called rye whiskey, which needs to be 51% rye at least. But rye whiskey is, personally, I believe, a bartender best friend. I've been love doing cocktail with rye whiskey simply because allow you to mix with whatever you like, and you will still feel the kick, that sort of warm on your chest, and that kick that you need when you drink a Manhattan. Even though to make rye whiskey is not as easy, because on the fermentation process, rye can be quite problematic. Now, distillers try to source rye from places that have cold climate, such as Canada, Dakota, or North Europe, Finland and Germany. The reason why is because they want rye that have low enzyme, and enzyme in rye will actually make a foamy fermented tank, and it's really, really hard to monitoring the fermentation with the rye, because you, for instance, you will need to add aggressive agitation to the tank to prevent the formation of rye ball, and obviously you don't want that, because inside the rye ball it doesn't ferment. You can have a creation or any sort of bacteria, then will completely spoil your beer. So it's not as easy as the grain that we just mentioned before. So let's talk about how rye is most often associated with spice and floral sensation, especially in rye whiskey or heavy rye bourbon. Now, by itself, the grain doesn't actually have spicy notes. There are 2 compounds in rye that actually make us associate with those flavor and sensation. Now, the 2 main compounds then are responsible for the flavor in rye, especially rye whiskey. It will be the first one, linalool. Linalool will be more often associated with those floral notes such as lavender or violet flower, which are most often present in whiskey that are not been aged for a long time. So the barrel didn't actually affect so much on the smell of the whiskey. The other important compound is ferulic acid. Now, with the right type of yeast, ferulic acid can be converted in 4-vinyl guaiacol, which are responsible for spicy notes, such as cloves, nutmeg, ginger, and black pepper. So with this video, I try to cover everything we need to know about fermentation. This is gonna be the base to talk about subjects such beer and any category of whiskey. I will go a bit more specific on the history or the production for every whiskey that we will mention, in the future, or even vodka, gin, aquavit, everything that is actually start from a fermented liquid based on grain. I also cover what for me are the Fantastic Four, so the main 4 grain that will cover all the category of whiskey up there. Of course, you can use any other grain. In the end of the day, you can use any grain as long as 100% grain. You can do whiskey from any source, and there are up there some whiskey that use different grain, or some experimental mash, and some curious distiller. But for me, those are the ones then will be the base for us to start to talk about all the subject of spirit up there. Also, if you like this video, please subscribe, and I invite you as well, if you are more curious, to go to our playlist Virtual Distillery Tour, when you will find such a legend as Steam Beam, Infante and Joe Rampe, talking about how the grain affect the fermentation tank, so the distilled beer, in the production of whiskey, specifically on bourbon, rye whiskey, and as well on some experimental quarter cask from the limestone branch. So I will definitely recommend to go and check it out, especially if you're curious. And if you like this video, please comment down below. Let me hear, you know, what for you should be the next subject that we should cover, and I'll be happy to share everything I know about it. So thank you for watching, guys, and stay safe.